traveling. But this is the current state of Microsoft Identity Security, common security issues and misconfigurations. So I am Sean Metcalf, founder and CTO of Trimark. I'm a Microsoft certified master in Active Directory. There's about 100 in the world, most of whom work at Microsoft. I started a company called Trimark. We have a booth, which is around the corner and down the street. Look for the squishy. We are giving these away, so come on over and grab one if you haven't already. I've spoken at a lot of conferences, first time speaking in B-Sides Dublin. This is my second time I was accepted to speak at B-Sides Dublin. Thank you. But this is my first time actually being here and speaking. So then people in the audience are like, well, what happened, Sean? Well, when I was going to speak at B-Sides Dublin, it was 2020. So I'm very happy to be a second-time speaker, but really a first-time speaker here. So thank you all for having me. I love speaking at conferences. Come by the Trimark booth. I love chatting with folks about their challenges and concerns about Microsoft Identity Security. So like I said, I have a lot to talk about. I'm going to talk about a number of things that we see as part of our security assessments at Trimark that we do for customers, and how that ties to interesting things that have happened in the wild, like the MGM breach. I'm going to talk about Okta integration. Anyone here heard of Okta, I'm sure? Probably use it. I'm not going to make you raise your hand, but there are some issues with that hybrid cloud configuration and what attackers can do with it. So at the tech conference a couple years ago, I spoke about what I call the identity nexus. And a nexus is just a connection of a couple of different elements. And so this identity nexus comes into play really well in technology because we have on-prem on the left side and cloud on the right side. And I know that some people are thinking, Sean, it actually has Entra ID in. I tell you what, once Microsoft changes every reference from Azure ID to Entra ID, I will only call it Entra ID. But you'll see in the slides, some places I often call it Entra ID and Azure ID together. By the way, if you sign up for an Entra ID P1 license, it actually says Azure AD P1 as the license on the user. So, don't blame me, blame Microsoft. But this looks very clean, right? At the top, we have the directory services. At the bottom, we have infrastructure. Just simplified VMware Azure, right? Makes sense. The problem is that it's not that clean. In real life is messy. There's a lot of connectivity. So what I call the identity nexus is a situation where we have interconnectivity among everything. And it's gotten so complex that, you add in Amazon AWS, another major cloud provider. And then we get into Active Directory where we have common security issues. So I'm going to talk about that. And in 2019, I did a talk at the Experts Conference at Tech, and I put up this slide and I said, this is the avenues to compromise of Active Directory in 2019. This is the problem that we have. Group policy permissions in Active Directory. Group nesting, it just expands the number of admins that we have all over. Accounts that are regular users that are admins. Service accounts that are all domain admins, because why not? It makes everything work. Kerberos delegation, password vaults, like CyberArk, Secret Server, Beyond Trust. Now what we're doing is we're taking these credentials and putting them to this other server that, guess what, we treat like another server. We should be treating it like a domain controller, but we don't in many cases. And then the backups. The backup has all that critical, sensitive Active Directory user information in it, but we don't treat that the same way as domain controller. So that was a number of years ago, 5 years if my math is right. So has it gotten better? Let's take a look. No, it's the same problem. We have the same problems 5 years later. Well, hopefully with this talk, it'll help you do your job better and enable you to be able to fix some of these things that we commonly see. So again, I'm going to show you some of the details here based on what I just said. In 2019, these were the things that I highlighted. It's a little better. Not a whole lot in 2024. So these red items here are still problems. We still see these all over the place. The ones in green are the ones that are much better. These are things that we don't see as much of this as we have in the past. But the items in red are still pretty consistently bad across a lot of environments. We do assessments of companies that are hundreds of users to up to 1 million or more. We've actually assessed an environment with 3 million user accounts. That was kind of crazy. They just never deleted any users, and it was a portal environment. So DMZ to the world, basically, their portal for all other vendors and everyone else, and never deleted an account. So that was really fun. But when we have Issues with Active Directory admin accounts, we have admin accounts with old passwords. We very often see accounts with 5-year-old passwords, 10-year-old passwords. Some passwords are 15 years old. Does anyone have a car that's 15 years old anymore? Probably not. Oh, there we go. One in the back. All right. There we go. 2, 3. Yeah. Okay. We're coming out of the woodwork now. Hopefully, you don't raise your hand if I say, do you have any administrative accounts in your environment with a password that's 15 years old? By the way, the default domain administrator account, that's one of the ones that typically never gets its password changed. And it's enabled, and it has rights by default. We have accounts with Kerberos service principal names. In order for Kerberos to work, you have to have a service account with a Kerberos spin, or service principal name, that basically enables you to connect that application to that service account, and tie that into Active Directory. So that's needed. But if you have accounts tied to people, there should be no Kerberos spins associated with those. Service accounts also, account usage. Where are these accounts logging on? How are they interacting with the system? Are they using an admin workstation? Based on what I've seen, they're not. Are you RDPing directly into the domain controller? Probably. Are you using a password vault to proxy it? Maybe. But we see this a lot. We see accounts with old passwords that are these Active Directory administrative accounts. These should change every year. Why do you think they should change every year? Well, people move on. You have admins that are there, then they move on. You have backups that are sitting out there for a while. We want to make sure that attackers don't have the ability to capture this. Now, in the U.S., NIST is one of the standard frameworks for security and for computer systems. One of the things that NIST and Microsoft actually said was, you don't have to change passwords anymore. And then there was an asterisk, It's like, by the way, there's more to that. Yes, you don't have to change passwords anymore, provided that you have some sort of password filter to prevent users from using bad passwords, because users never use bad passwords. And really, you should have some sort of MFA or multi-factor authentication or two-factor associated with that account. If you do that, then you're in pretty good shape. But we still feel at Trimark that you should be changing your Active Directory admin accounts every year or two, really depending on what other controls that you have in place. Again, it's adjustable. Because password spraying is a situation where an attacker can take a list of passwords and then attempt to authenticate as every one of the users in the organization, in the environment. And if there's any pen testers or red teamers in here, you know that works all the time. You're going to find accounts that you have guessed the password for. Kerberosing is that ability to effectively get a Kerberos service ticket for a service account, again, because it's tied to that application in Active Directory, and then take that service ticket offline and attempt to crack it. So that means the service accounts with 10-year-old passwords, the attackers are going to be able to crack those and figure them out because they have time on their side. So there's a number of checks that you should be doing for these AD admin accounts. Again, looking for these old passwords. This PowerShell commandlet at the bottom or at the top here, this command, get AD group member. This will give you the membership of the administrators group and all of the subgroups, the members of that. We also have a free script here that will do a number of checks in the environment to look for the more common things that are in there. So improving AD admin account security. These are the key things that really everyone should be doing. And these are things that we don't see being done often enough in the environment. Making sure that you're limiting the accounts that are in these privileged AD admin groups. Domain admins should be rarely used, if ever, which is kind of a weird thing to say given that that's the administrative group that everyone uses. But domain admins by default have full access and control to Active Directory, domain controllers, all workstations, all servers, everything in the environment. You can put those accounts into the administrators group instead, and that will limit it and source it just to Active Directory, the service, and be able to administer domain controllers. We want to make sure that the passwords change. You start with the approach that no service accounts have AD admin rights. And then you start asking questions. Well, what rights do they require? What do they need these rights for? Why are they here? And then there's protections that you can do against Kerberos delegation attacks, which are very common now. The best thing to do is to add these accounts, these accounts associated with people into the protected users group. Jake Hilthers from the Trimark team recently did a talk, and the slides are available on hub.trimarksecurity.com, talking about not just getting into the protected users group, but actually here's the process on how to do it. Here's how to phase it out. And he's going to be releasing a tool later this year that he's calling SuperPUG, because PUG, Protected Users Group, PUG, which will enable and provide the ability to step through this process, because that really breaks the majority of the delegation attacks against AD administrators. Of course, making sure that any accounts associated with people don't have Kerberos spins on them because they don't need them. That's for service accounts. And then get rid of those accounts that are no longer in use. Find them far too often. Kerberos delegation is this interesting thing where you have the user and they log into a web server, call it SharePoint, right? And when they log into this web server, they're using their Kerberos ticket. Well, that web server can authenticate that user because of how Kerberos works. But the problem is that this backend SQL database server that SharePoint uses to store the data, this web server can't do any updates on the database server as the user by default in Kerberos, because this user is just authenticated to the web server. So enter delegation. Delegation means impersonation. So effectively, delegation enables this web server to impersonate the user in order to make the changes on the database. This makes sense because if you want to know who made changes in your database or who's accessing it, this is the way it has to work. The problem is that there's a number of attacks leveraging delegation. In 2015, I highlighted at a Black Hat talk how unconstrained delegation is incredibly dangerous because the user's proof of identity, their TGT in Kerberos, is placed in that server memory when that happens. So if this web server is configured for unconstrained delegation, all an attacker needs to do is compromise this web server to compromise every user that is authenticated to it through Kerberos. And then they'll be able to have access to the whole environment. This gets even worse if you're able to trick a domain admin, Active Directory admin, into logging into that system using Kerberos. Everyone here probably has worked with a vulnerability scanner, right? I'm assuming at some point in your environment, no matter what the vendor is, when that vulnerability scanner hits a web server or a server that's running unconstrained delegation using Kerberos, what do you think happens? That proof of identity for that vulnerability scan account ends up in memory on the server. And so now the attacker, if they're able to compromise that server, they compromise the entire environment. So it's really important to remove unconstrained delegation, move to constrained. Unconstrained delegation is what was available in Active Directory in the beginning, the early days, 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003. We shouldn't be using it anymore. There's a couple of very interesting corner cases where it's still required, but for the most part, you should be able to get to constrained. Protect these accounts from delegation attacks, especially those that are highly privileged admin accounts, by setting that flag, this account is sensitive and cannot be delegated. Then move on to also adding it to the protected user group, which protects the authentication controls and security around it. Because once you're in the protected user group, you can only authenticate using Kerberos AES. You cannot use Kerberos DES, you cannot use NTLM. Much shorter. So we also see issues with custom permissions. I don't have time to go into all the different permissions that we've seen. Come to the Trimark group. I'll be happy to tell you about some of the wacky things that we've seen. On the domain level, the OU level, group policy. So this is a big one. We have often seen a group policy linked to domain controllers, the container for domain controllers, and the servers OU. Because for a lot of folks that are server admins, a domain controller is a server. Why wouldn't I have a group policy that applies to both? And then a server admins team actually can manage that group policy that applies to domain controllers and servers. For those who aren't as familiar with Active Directory, that's a bad thing. Because if I can modify that group policy that links to the domain controllers, I can change the security of it. I can change the membership of the administrators group. I can run it and install code on that domain controller. Because that's how group policy works. It's basically an engine to make changes to that system. And then, as I'm saying, basically full control or modify on the permissions provides the ability to make changes to that group policy. The other thing we look at is user rights assignments. These are very interesting because these control who has what rights into that system, but also to Active Directory itself when these group policies apply to the domain controllers. And then there's a number of concerning configurations that we look for as well in assessments. So on the domain controllers, there's a bunch of things that shouldn't be done. First of all, principal or service should not be running on a domain controller at all, again, ever. A number of years ago, the folks from SpectreOps did a presentation at DerbyCon, and they talked about this printer bug, which is basically a combination of a principle or situation that they identified on a domain controller in unconstrained delegation. They basically could trick the domain controller into providing its credentials through unconstrained delegation to another server because of this issue with the principal or service. Effectively, you could set up a notify and have it send to whatever server you wanted to using whatever authentication method you wanted to. So you use Kerberos. What I just talked about with unconstrained delegation happens where the domain controller's computer account Kerberos ticket gets put on that server. But since then, there's been a number of research around this where principal or service is just too dangerous. We rate that as a critical when we do assessment. So make sure the principal or service is not running on domain controllers. You can disable that through group policy very easily. A number of problems with event auditing. It's default. It doesn't use the advanced auditing that came about in 2008, in the 2008 timeframe. So there's 53 categories with that in advanced auditing, and there were only 8 or 9 before that. So a lot more granular alerts for detecting potentially malicious activity. User rights assignments on DCs, as I mentioned, the ability to controls the additional options in administration and permissions and rights on that. Installed applications and agents. We see some crazy ones. I'll talk about that in a minute. Old versions of VMware tools. Just about every domain controller now is virtualized, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud. That cloud environment or that virtual environment has control over that domain controller through the agent that it has on it, whether it's an Amazon agent or it's a VMware agent. We often find old versions of VMware. Insecure remote access tools. Anyone remember VNC? Anyone think that's secure? No, it's completely unencrypted. And it's completely unencrypted. And not only that, but the password had a default, and the password would go across in clear text. So really, really bad situation with that. So we have found VNC on a domain controller in the past year or two. And then it's still running Windows Server 2012 or older. So when I talk about user rights assignments, this is what I'm talking about. Add workstations to the domain. Things like Curb Relay Up leverage the ability to add workstations to the domain, which is a default right for all users. We can't do that anymore. We can't allow users to be able to do that. The ability to log on locally and log on through terminal services. The ability to debug programs. This is something that anyone, Mimikatz, who knows Mimikatz? SE debug, you're familiar with that? Yeah, basically what that does is provides that session within Mimikatz the debug program rights, which basically gives you developer rights to that system, which enables you to pull the credentials from LSAS and interact with the system at a much deeper level. By default, administrators are there. No one needs that right? So you can remove that. Developers will say they need it. So enable computer and user accounts to be trusted for delegation. I was just talking about how dangerous delegation can be. By default, it would be like domain administrators, domain admins or administrators. I have seen this set for another group. That means they can create delegation or set up delegation in the environment. That is very dangerous. That should not be configured that way. Only your 80 admins should manage that. Load and unload device drivers. You can compromise DCs with that right. Manage auditing and security log. For some reason, Exchange still needs it, but hopefully you're not using on-prem Exchange. Once you get rid of on-prem Exchange, you should remove Exchange from having that right, because that provides the ability to clear those security logs. And then the last one is pretty interesting. Take ownership of files and objects. So in Windows, when you create something, you are the creator owner, you have owner rights on that. Same thing in Active Directory. When you create something, you have owner rights on it. Owner rights enables you to actually change the permissions on it. And so this gets really interesting because if you have the ability to take ownership of an object in Active Directory, you can change the permissions on it. Very, very dangerous. And finally, on this not on domain controllers application list, this is a list of things that we've seen. These should not be on domain controllers. Certainly not these, Firefox, Chrome, or Brave, which I've seen recently. If you are using your domain controller as a web browser, please don't do that. That's dangerous. Because there's this thing called like web attacks, and you go to websites, and they even just adware and stuff like that will install things. And the other thing is web browsers aren't always the most secure products and software in the world. So yeah, don't do that. And SQL is a bad idea. ADFS, Azure AD Connect, and of course things like VNC. Don't do that either. But we've also seen some fairly typical agents on domain controllers from VMware tools. This is the current version. I looked this up a couple days ago. It's 12.4.0. We've seen 8. Version 8 is probably about 6, 7 years old. That's a problem. And if I don't know if most people in the room have been keeping up with it, but VMware's had a lot of security issues over the past few years. VMware tools notwithstanding. So anything older than 10.1.0 are vulnerable to a significant security issue through something called the VIX API. The VIX API provided unauthenticated access through VMware into that actual VM. And we did a proof of concept for a customer because we identified this. And their Active Directory environment was pristine. It was one of the best we've ever seen. We had minimal issues that we identified. We had VMware, they had VMware. And at the time, we had one of our VMware subject matter experts working on this engagement because we knew that their AD environment would be pretty good, but we also knew that they had a pretty large VMware farm. So as part of the consulting engagement, we did some VMware work with them. And we showed them how we could actually run code on the domain controller unauthenticated all the way through using VIX API. So this is very dangerous. Make sure you have a newer version. EDR is a remote access tool. Okay? We've heard of a RAT. An EDR is the remote access tool that the good folks use. The bad folks use the RAT. They work the same. It's basically running code on another system remotely through an agent. SCCM, we see this less and less, thankfully, the management of it. But basically, what we really want to see, and Microsoft says, is to make sure your patching system for domain controllers is separate and different from the rest of your environment. Domain controllers should be tier 0. They should be protected at the highest level. And then Splunk Universal Porter. Default install, at least when I looked at this a few years ago, had the ability to run code. So just be aware of that as well. Only run supported versions of Windows on your domain controllers. These are the most important servers on your network. We did an assessment recently, and all of the DCs were running 2019 except 6, and they were running 2012. Critical. Sorry, it's 2012 is, let's see, it's 2024 now, 2012. 12 years old. Okay? We should not be running a 12-year-old operating. Anyone have a 12-year-old car? Not those folks that already said they had a 15-year car. 15-year-old car. But yeah, we shouldn't be doing that anymore. And so I'm not going to go through this slide. This is kind of the capture of what we should be doing with that domain controller security. If you care about your Active Directory security, you should be caring about your domain controller security. Because the domain controllers are your security for Active Directory. And so ADCS. This is Microsoft PKI. Unfortunately, apparently there's a problem with a tool where you can go next, 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 finish, and it's PKI. PKI is complex, right? We can't diffuse that, boil that down to next, next, finish. So I'm going to go through these slides fairly quickly. There's a number of things and problems with it. We have released a tool for free on our GitHub called Locksmith. And it goes through and not only identifies the issues with ADCS, but it will also provide fixes. It generates the cert-util code and command to actually run and fix these. The first one is ADCS auditing. So this is the default here. And let's see if anyone can notice the difference between what the default is and what the recommended one is. Yeah, for some reason, Microsoft thought it would be great to just not set up any auditing on this at all. So that's a problem. Also, the certificate templates often have issues because of the way they're configured. Basically, there is a configuration to allow a person to say, oh, by the way, I want the subject of the certificate to be domain controllers. We shouldn't be able to do that either. That's basically me going onto the plane and writing on my boarding pass pilot, and then going into the cockpit and sitting down and being like, hey, we're going to be boarding, but first we need to let more people on because we're going to open up that airplane door again. And we're going to leave the gate and go back again. That's a callback to an earlier thing where I think there were 20 people in the room. So there's 20 folks got this show. In the bottom, we found this at least one certificate that matches the description in 95% of the environments we've assessed. What does this mean? ADCS is vulnerable in every environment. Run Locksmith. This weird thing here, edit attribute secure subject alt name to, Basically, it allows you to say who you want the cert to be for. It's very similar to what I just talked about. So I can say, I want to be a domain admin. So I'll be a domain admin. And then Microsoft says don't do that. But they allow you to do it, and there's a lot of environments where we see this configured. And then the HTTP endpoints, really get rid of NTLM, make sure it's HTTPS, get these things fixed and cleaned up. Like I said, the Trimark GitHub, Locksmith, great tool. We'll go through and identify things, really will help you solve this. You don't have to look at any slides, just run Locksmith, honestly, because all the things I talk about are there. And as I said, it identified here that auditing is not enabled. It's set to 0. Run this cert util command, and it'll set it all, and then restart the service for you. So then auditing is working. So let's move on to the cloud. See, I told you, Azure and Entra ID, I did it. We see a lot of issues with configurations. The common issues are privileged account issues. Standard user accounts are members of privileged roles. Service accounts, service principals are members. These generic type accounts. Accounts can authenticate from any workstation. Because how do we manage cloud? In the web browser. Probably the same web browser we're using for Facebook, Instagram. I'm not going to mention one of the others because they're a sponsor. But all these other sites that are like social media sites are there in our web browser. And how does authentication work in the web browser? We use our username and password. Hopefully we use MFA. Hopefully we do. But then we get a cookie. We get that session token that's stored as a cookie. And there's a way in a web browser to interact and steal cookies from them. So that means if I can steal that cookie and that session token, I can move it over to another web browser and continue as the admin for a period of time. Using PIM, Privileged Identity Management, where you can actually go in and out and we can control it so that people are eligible for a role, but they're not a member of that role group the whole time. And no MFA configured. Applications that are highly privileged. Group nesting is back in the cloud because it was so popular and on-prem. And then partner access, delegated access permission. Basically, Microsoft set it up so that if you have a cloud service provider, you could actually give them the ability to manage your tenant. And sometimes you didn't realize they could manage your tenant and have global admin rights because that part of the portal was buried. Microsoft has now moved it up to one of the top-level pages so you can actually click on it.
We fixed it. It expires now. We work at Microsoft. You'll be getting the follow-up for this after.
Oh, great. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, Microsoft. And that's it for me.
We didn't fix everything else, but we fixed that.
Thank you, Dublin. Good night. So here's what we see. Standard user accounts. First name, last name. These are very common. And all the ones here are standard user accounts. And they are permanent active members. That's a problem. Like I said, they are permanent members. And I'm just using the portal here, so you can see this in the Microsoft portal. I got these screenshots several months ago, so it's probably changed. So please bear with me. And then we can use PowerShell, the Graph API, to pull information about who's registered for different things. So this guy, Sean, at Big Megacorp, apparently is using Microsoft Authenticator, passwordless. That's great. Registered for MFA. Is MFA capable? That's good. Is passwordless capable? But all these standard user accounts don't have MFA. That's a problem. And there are 100 Entra ID roles. I double-checked this, like a few weeks ago. There's 100 Entra ID roles. It is almost impossible to know what these are and what they're for. I've gone through them. So I had some time on my hands. And these are the ones that Microsoft say are privileged, with the tag of privilege. And the great thing is Microsoft shows the permissions why they're tagged as privileged. My only concern about this is we have Global Administrator, which is the highest, most privileged role group of all of them. And right next to that, we have Global Reader, which is the lowest of all the privileges because it can just read everything. Now, I understand why. Because Global Reader can read a lot of things that are sensitive, like BitLocker keys. However, I don't put them on the same level. So here, as of 422. And there's 26 of these roles. So at Trimark, we wanted to make this easier for our customers and for the community. So what we did was we broke these down in what we call levels. Levels are similar to tiers, but Microsoft called them tiers, so we call them levels. So level 0 is similar to tier 0. This is basically Global Administrator, and Hybrid Identity Administrator, which has the ability to modify federation settings. And this link here, we'll talk about why that's dangerous. You can modify federation settings, you can control authentication to the environment. Partner Tier 2 support, which is something that my friend Andy over at SpectreOps published a number of months ago. Partner Tier 2 support can reset passwords and invalidate refresh tokens for all non-administrators and administrators, including global admins. So that's kind of dangerous. Partner Tier 2 is not supposed to be used. I don't know when it was supposed to be used, but it's also hidden from the main role list. So it's one of those things where you have to really dig in to find it. Privileged Authentication Administrator, Microsoft says do not use, but people use it. And here we have the ability to reset passwords. Privileged Role Administrator can manage role assignments, including Global Administrator. So very obviously Tier 0, Level 0, right? Well, we continue with Level 1. I'm not going to go through all of these. Again, the slides will be published. So you can see here that there's a number of them, and Microsoft actually, most of the ones that Microsoft says are privileged, we have here. We have added a couple additional ones, and the ones in bold that I have here are actually ones that could be considered really level 0, depending on the configuration of the environment. So Application Administrator, Cloud Application Administrator, Directory Synchronization Accounts, these have the ability to modify application permissions. In the case of directory synchronization, they can update credentials to service principals. So if I can modify an application, so for example, Application Administrator, Cloud Application Administrator, probably the big two, if I can modify or add a credential to an application, I can impersonate that application. I can add a password to that application by having that role. And I'll talk about why that's dangerous. I have added Exchange Administrator to what we call Level 1. Why? Because I have worked in breaches where the attacker has compromised an Exchange admin and basically then set authenticated users to have read mail rights on every mailbox in the environment. That is like forever persistence for all the mail ever, because that is almost never going to be identified and found. That's what you can do when you have Exchange admin rights. So we consider this Level 1. Partner Tier 1 support has also the ability to update application credentials. So these are the ones really you should focus on the most, right? Spend your time on level 0, then look at Level 1. And Microsoft has a chart, but I like Andy's better. So it's here, and it talks about who can change what password if they're in what role. It's very confusing. But Andy put a great chart together. It's linked at the bottom. And group nesting is back. So Microsoft realized in customer feedback, well, we want to have groups that we can put in these roles. We don't want to have direct members in Global Administrator because that seems too simple. So what we want to do is we have a group. So Microsoft said, okay, we'll create this thing called a role assignable group because we learned our lesson from Active Directory a bit. And we're not going to make it so that admins can make changes to this group. We're going to make sure that this role assignable group can only be created by the Global Administrator and the I just blanked on it. It's this one here, the Privileged Role Administrator. Thank you, slides. They're the only ones that can create the role assignable groups and can modify the membership, except if you have a certain application permission and if you are an owner of that role assignable group, then you can manage the membership. So this is where things get a little bit interesting. So we have a number of global admins here, and we have this role assignable group. The thing I hate about the portal is you would think I could click into this and see who the members are. You cannot. You then have to go into the groups pane in there and then search for that group in order to see who the members are. That doesn't seem easier to me. And so then we go to the groups in order to look this up, and then we can see that we have a bunch of user accounts. This is probably the most common scenario that we see in assessments, where we have a role assignable group that's in a role, and then people have not done a good job of managing who's in it. We also have owners that are user rights that have been added in there. They can control the membership of that. This is the global admins role assignable group that has global admin rights. These users can change the membership of this group and effectively add people into global admins. That seems like a problem to me. Just like we did level 0 for roles, we also do that for applications. These are the application permissions that we consider tier 0. So if you have applications that have any of these permissions at your tenant level, now your application administrator and your cloud application administrator should be considered level 0 roles, because they have the ability to add credentials to the applications that have these rights. Directory read write all, Microsoft says that this is effectively a global admin level permission. I did put an asterisk because there is some conversation on the internet about what can they really do and is it really that powerful? I'm going to go with what Microsoft said and stick with that. App role assignment, read write all. This allows an application to grant additional privileges to itself, other applications, or any other user. That's a problem. Role management, read write directory, managing directory role. These are just all very bad. Like anything with this is going to be problematic. You can review these with the PowerShell script at the bottom. We'll get into that. But application owners, again, have the ability to add a credential to that application. So during the SolarWinds times, there was a cloud breach of a major security company, and they couldn't figure out how. But basically, they figured out that there was a partner that had rights to that environment. And we can look at that by going to delegated admin partners. And like I said, if it says global admin, that's a problem. If you see any partners here, that's a problem. You want to check into that, see why they have those rights, remove them if possible. Even better is move to granular delegated admin privileges. So Microsoft had a big issue where there was a signing key for their consumer environment, cloud environment, that had been lost. It had been acquired. And so what ended up happening was, according to Microsoft, a China-based threat group gained access to the signing key, which enabled them to then create whatever tokens they wanted in order to access the consumer side of the Microsoft Cloud. However, there were a number of problems with this, and I'm not going to read through this. I'm going to show you the picture because I like pictures. Then you can read the details later. Here's the picture. So basically, there was a crash dump in that environment. That went to crash dump analysis in a production environment which connected to the internet. They believe Storm 0558 gained access to that. And then what they did was they created their own token, and they used OWA to then connect to Exchange Online to basically pull email from it. And the reason why this was possible was because of a comedy of errors. The comedy of errors was that basically there was no validation on the enterprise side to ensure that consumer keys couldn't be used. And so CISA did a scathing report of this situation, basically a cascade of failures on Microsoft's part. And 22 enterprise organizations, while 503 related personal accounts worldwide were affected by this situation. The worst part about it was that the logs were not accessible without premium service. So CISA said, Microsoft, you need to change this because basically from what CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency of the federal government of the United States, said Microsoft was prioritizing profits over security. Microsoft has since come out and said, we're changing this. So Midnight Blizzard basically is a threat group in Russia, and they were the ones that had compromised portions of Microsoft's email system because of a situation where there was a test tenant with an account that shouldn't have had any rights, but actually had rights under the Microsoft environment. That's a problem. What's interesting is Microsoft has some information about password spraying. That account, that test tenant was password spray, had no MFA configured on it. So your big takeaway here is to ensure MFA is there. So with Okta, hold on a second. So, all right, so I still have like 5 minutes, so that's good. So thank you. So with Okta, Adam Chester had published this in September about the way that Okta integration works. And you'll notice down here the customers that they have were pretty interesting. I'm not going to call any of these out by name, but it's pretty interesting, the ones that are here. But he published this great article about Okta for red teamers. And what he highlighted was that you can have delegated access, which is similar to Azure AD and one of the configurations there where you can SSO from Okta to pretty much any other system. But if you can compromise the Okta service account in AD, then you can auth to Okta as any AD user and SSO to anything else, which is pretty interesting. You can also have leverage the Okta agent, which basically if you can get onto that agent, then you can see the clear text username and passwords. Or if you could create your own agent, then you could get things rolling through that, and you could do what you want and basically create your own access to other systems. So again, Adam Chester put this together, and it was interesting because Okta themselves have had their own issues. In fact, it says here, support engineers were also able to facilitate the resetting of passwords and MFA factors for users. That's pretty powerful. So they've had their own issues. So the risk really comes down to, all right, we're having some problems with the cloud, but we have a lot of trust there. And the reality is that the business of cybercrime is run like a real business. I mean, they have support engineers, they have support hotlines, they have support email addresses. It's run like a business, for profit, and it's very effective. And so with MGM, they realized how effective this was because they got ransomware. They got ransom. And Caesars did too. Caesars paid apparently like $20 million. MGM didn't, and ended up spending probably $100 million in getting this fixed. And these are just some slides showing like what they said over time as we learned more about what was going on with MGM. And so this is very telling. All they did was they hopped on LinkedIn, find an employee, and then called the help desk. So a company valued at $1,000 million, $33.9 billion was defeated by a 10-minute conversation. Unfortunately, this is the reality we have today because our security controls aren't good enough. And this affected everything. These are gaming systems at MGM. And the notes here from the attacker was, look at that. They were able to sniff the passwords on the Okta agent server. They got super admin privileges to their Okta system. They had global admin privileges to the Azure tenant. They launched ransomware against ESXi, which is VMware. That was pretty huge. Like I said, Caesars had published in America now. Any company that's a publicly traded company has to publish an SEC filing if they have a breach. Companies have not done a good job of really being honest in this, and they're starting to get called out on it. So, what is the current state of Microsoft Identity Security? You think it's good? Active Directory, do you think it's good? No. In our assessments, we find for our MCSA, which is our Azure AD Entra ID Security Assessment, 34% have the highest level of severity rating. This is at least one critical, which is like compromise like that. So this is over a third. Do we think it's better in Active Directory? Yes or no? No, far worse. 76% of Active Directory environments we see across just about every industry of just about every size, 3/4 of those Active Directory environments have at least one critical. This is a problem. Things have not gotten better, unfortunately. But there's hope. So we have published Locksmith. We have published a PowerShell tool, Invoke Trimark AD checks. We have an article with that which goes through some of the quick wins. And like I said, there's a lot of issues with a lot of things. We can fix these things. We can get to a better place with all of the security in these systems. We need our vendors to do better. Please ask them to do better. But we can make things better. Again, this goes to our link tree. You can get access to dozens of papers that we published on improving security. We have white papers that we published on how to improve Active Directory security more quickly. We're available at the booth. Like I said, come and find one of the little red dragons. But that's been my time. Thank you very much for yours.